Good morning, and what a fantastic song to start this Thursday morning seminar on community engagement. I'm Luke Tatton, Account Manager at Concilio Communications, and I'm also a member of WPA's NextGen committee. Today we'll be discussing how community engagement has evolved since COVID-19, and we've got an expert panel who's all really eager to be discussing and debating the key topics to come out of this. Our speakers include Emily Laverick, who's Marketing Director at Built ID, Hannah Loftus, who's Associate at Public Practice and also Director at HAT Projects, and Nicola Wood, who's Community Engagement Manager at Grosvenor GBI. Just to note that throughout the seminar, we're going to have a number of interactive surveys which will pop up and ask you your opinions on the discussion topics that we'll be debating. So please be prepared to get ready to answer some of those. And before we start, I'd also just like to say many thanks to Gardner and Theobald for their continued support for both CPA and WPA NextGen initiatives. G&T have been providing sponsorship and expertise to support our NextGen groups, which in turn allows us to put on events like this, which is aimed at helping young professionals in the industry expand their expertise and contacts. So many thanks to G&T for their ongoing support. So, as many as you know, COVID-19 has had a massive effect on a lot of industries, and we've seen that particularly challenging for planning and community engagement, which has traditionally focused on face-to-face contact and communication. However, despite this, there's been a number of adaptations that have been introduced to try and adapt to the new normal. Most notably in March, the government introduced new legislation which enabled local authorities to host virtual planning committees, which was a complete first in the UK. Westminster City Council was one of the first local authorities to embrace that, and they hosted their first virtual planning committee in early April. Since then, they've reintroduced speakers into the planning committees, and they've embraced technology by hosting virtual site visits and introducing 3D modelling to replace those traditional site visits, which ordinarily they may not have been able to do. So we've seen planning being able to adapt and evolve, and what we're going to be looking at today is how our industry, community engagement, has done the same. So on that point, let's open up to the panel with the first question about how COVID-19 has affected our sector and whether you've noticed any big changes, opportunities, or certain innovations to come out of the pandemic. So Emily, why don't we start with you and your experience at Built ID?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for having me on the panel. I'm really excited to be here. I think definitely in our organisation, COVID has helped us uncover sort of different applications for the platform. So whether that's assisting with the COVID response and giving communities the opportunity to decide how sort of vacant retail units are used to support the response in terms of storing food boxes for key workers or helping the homeless. We've also seen the platform used for tenant management and being approached to use for return to work. So yeah, we've seen lots of different applications.
Okay, and Built ID was one of the first to embrace digital technology and a digital platform for engagement. So has it been business as usual for you guys, or have you seen a lot more different? You were saying you've seen different applications. What else have you kind of seen?
We've seen a huge spike in engagement, I would say, actually. We've seen the community giving sort of really constructive feedback and really thinking about the feedback that they're given. I mean, they do always, but different sort of examples of developments all over the world and how we can make it more sustainable and green. And they've been a lot more engaged is what I would say.
Yeah, because I know from our experience at Concilio, we launched Your Say, which is our digital engagement platform. It was in the pipeline, but COVID-19 has definitely been a catalyst for that. And I think, like you say, the level of engagement's a lot better. I think people respond to having it on the web where they can visit the plans anytime they like. The plans are obviously a lot easier to understand. It's all there for them to read through and reread through. So I think from our side as well, we've definitely seen a level of engagement that's been really impressive. So that's good to hear that's been happening across the industry. Nicola, I mean, Grosvenor have a slightly different experience. You're a landed estate in Westminster. You've got quite a long-term view in a diverse portfolio. What sort of experiences have you been having?
I think over the past few months, everyone would agree that we've seen the importance of communities, and many communities have shown real resilience and strengthened relationships of people coming together to support each other. And that's also within a time that there's a bit of a backdrop of a lack of trust, which we know has been quite low in recent years. So one way that we, Grosvenor, are trying to respond to that is through our community charter, which is called Positive Space. And this launched in June, and it really sets out our commitment to meaningfully involve communities in the future of their neighbourhoods. So whilst its primary audience is Grosvenor, to kind of get our own house in order, it's also there as a prompt to reset and kind of rise the expectation of the industry. So it might be interesting to others that are listening. The launch of that came at quite an interesting time. So community engagement has been under a particular lens and focus due to this crisis, as you mentioned. And our project engagement has been a little tricky because of this, and there's been a lot to learn. So we've got a few significant projects that are at quite different critical stages. One that we've just started is the redesign of Grosvenor Square in Mayfair. And that's actually been the most challenging because COVID hit right at the start of that conversation, and we only managed one public event in March with lots of hand sanitizer at the ready. So it's quite new to people, and there wasn't already that engaged a following, which a physical presence would have really benefited. So we've been able to take that programme online with various Zoom talks and digital workshops, which we found really helpful to couple with some of the more offline methods. And equally, social media has been really helpful to promote that conversation a bit more widely, but it has taken a while to kind of identify the best way to run those campaigns. And then on the other end of the spectrum is Cundy Street in Belgravia, which we've submitted the planning application for last month. It was slightly easier to keep up that dialogue because we already had a very engaged community, strong personal relationships, a large mailing list, and we could run webinars and invite everyone that we already knew along to take part. And we actually started off that project using Built ID. So we led really strong on the digital and got a great response. Over 700 people took part, but we potentially didn't get the basics right, and we still had a lot to learn about the communities and residents that lived there. Yeah,
so it's fair to say that there's been a difference in the approach depending on where the project is in its project management, and then the newer projects have seemed a bit more difficult to try and get off the ground. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's definitely fair to say, and I think that speaks to the fact that there's needed to be a bit of a shake-up where traditional methods of engagement are great to some extent, but they're just not working for the full diverse community that we are supposed to be building for. So it came at a good time.
Yeah, I think that's the key way to look at it, is that it's a mixed economy, right? So that the more choices, the more transparency, and so the better results that you're going to have. Whether that's microsites, live chats, better presentation of material, all mixed in there with traditional methods of engagement. There's no one size fits all, and those mix and range of tools are actually really important. Hannah, how about yourself? Because you've got quite a unique experience in that you're running your own communications business, but you also work in the public sector, if that's correct. So what's been the difference between the two for you? Oh, sorry, Hannah, I think you're just on mute. There we go.
In my role with the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service, where I lead on communications and community engagement on a number of large strategic plans, what is very important is that we do continue to reach out, as you say, in a variety of methods. Just because some people can't do the face-to-face sorts of things we might be doing doesn't mean that there aren't other analogue methods out there that we should be using. And I think the other thing that is really important, and I think this really is good practice in engagement anyway, but definitely comes to the forefront right now, is to work through existing organisations on the ground, really trying to support existing community groups, existing forums, existing networks, whether that's food banks or other networks, and use them as a way to build trust in the community. Sometimes I think we have the tendency to go in and kind of, try and just create a whole new structure, a whole new group or something to do our work through, when actually there are some really great organisations on the ground already, and the more we can work through them, the more trusted we'll be in the community.
Great. And one of those organisations is Public Practice, which I think you're also involved with. do you mind just briefly explaining that? Because I'm conscious maybe a few listeners might not know what that is. So just briefly explain it with a few of your main aims that you're looking to achieve out of it.
So public practice is really a scheme for getting a more diverse range of people to work in the public sector within planning and related disciplines. And it was set up a few years ago, really as a way to address the skills shortage within local authorities. And also I think local authorities not always knowing how to recruit really effectively. I think there are a lot of practitioners within the private sector who have amazing experience, but probably do want to do something that's a bit more socially oriented or a bit more strategic as well. You know, sometimes when you're a consultant, you come in and it's about the brief that you're given, and actually it's shaping that brief that's really important. There's only so much you can do as a consultant if the strategic context isn't right. So public practice is a way for people from the private sector or from other sectors to essentially take a year's placement, bringing additional value and their skills into a local authority as a secondment or something similar to that. And then, for instance, in my case, that's led on to a more permanent role in the planning service, building on that, which I continue to balance and do part-time alongside my private practice as well.
Great, that's really interesting, and I've got to say very impressive that you're wearing all those different hats at the same time, so fair play. I just want to...
Oh, sorry, just so everybody knows, there's actually a round of recruitment for public practice open at the moment, which closes on the 20th of July. So if anyone is interested in those sorts of roles, if you go to a website, you can find out about how to apply. And it's great. It's brought a really diverse range of people. You know, our figures on minority, ethnic and Black people in the cohorts are really fantastic, and women as well. So I think it's a great way of breaking out from the usual suspects.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure we can probably send that link as well around to the different attendees today. I just want to keep on the public and private aspect for a moment. So do you think the public sector has to lead the conversation around community engagement? Is it their responsibility to try and raise the quality of engagement that's happening in their borough? I mean, Westminster City Council announced that they're introducing a pre-application community engagement protocol, which is all about trying to raise the standards, have an equal standard about all the applications they're receiving. So do you want to see more of that? Do you think council should be doing more of that? Or do you think the business and market can be raising its own standards?
I think it is a bit of both, but I think it is quite variable because it's not something that's easily measured. And I think one of the challenges with community engagement is doing it with integrity and asking questions and measuring your impact in a way that is comparing apples with apples, if you like, across the board. And, you know, to what Nicola was saying, I think that's just incredibly important for the development industry. If we are going to be trusted, we need to kind of sign up to some benchmarks to say, you know, we are going to compare against demographic data for the borough. We are going to compare against some of these really important measurables. And ultimately the local authorities, you know, are the democratically elected bodies. And so they have this responsibility towards their electors, the citizens, the voters in that borough to do the right thing by them. Having said that, I think, you know, boroughs and local authorities really vary in the expertise they have, and I think that's where something like public practice is really useful, because actually some consultation experts and people from the private sector can really bring those skills into a local authority, question some of the practice, you know, some of the sort of accepted ways of doing things, and make that better, so that when there are protocols like the one that Westminster is bringing in, they're kind of well founded on research. We have to be really honest about where the research sits here and what is a kind of good standard of practice across, essentially it's social science, isn't it? You know, we are doing social research and we should hold ourselves to those sorts of standards, I believe. Okay, that's great. And Emily, Built Idea, a company that managed to spot a gap in the market, and they've been doing community engagement online for a few years now. Like Hannah said, it's all about integrity and making sure that communities' voices are heard and they're incorporated into different designs. How does someone like Built ID try and build that trust with the communities and show them that their comments are being heard and there's tangible results in their feedback?
Yeah, so before every consultation, we'll run what we call a design thinking workshop. So we explore the desirability. So do the community want to see it? The feasibility, is it possible for the developer to deliver this? And the economically viability. So is it actually going to give a commercial return? So that means that the community are only being asked questions where they can genuinely influence change. So it's not sort of avoiding a box ticking exercise, basically. So yeah, we found that really helped since we introduced that. And also the influence decision section of the platform really helps, because it shows the community that their decisions are actually making change, and they can see what they've changed as well.
So do you think you've had a bit of success on that on both sides of the table, with your client and the community that you're working in?
Yeah, definitely, because it builds trust with the community, because they can see that their feedback is being listened to, I think, and also the developers are, in the end, building better places that the communities can use. Yeah,
absolutely. And that building trust is so key. And I know WPA have been doing some work on it. And Nicola, you touched it on earlier. It's a massive scheme of work for Grosvenor. I think earlier in the year, or was it late last year, you released that report which said that trust between the development and the communities in which they're operating is at an all-time low. And recently you also touched on it. There was that Positive Spaces report that you've released. So do you want to perhaps just touch on that, and what is Grosvenor actually trying to achieve through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Positive Space is our community charter, which was launched directly off the back of the trust research that we did as a response to it, in order to rebuild that trust amongst communities. And actually the report and benchmarking that Hannah mentioned, it was very encouraging to see Positive Space pulled out there as an example of these types of benchmarks and aims we as developers need to hold ourselves account to. So it's based around 4 principles, and there's a series of commitments within those which set out how we will engage locally. So just to give you a flavour of them, that includes things like listening first, starting really early and working with communities to identify a list of priorities that we can then hopefully respond to, but also ensuring that we're really representing everyone. And we know at the moment that young people are the least represented in planning, which does feel quite strange, particularly as they're not only the people we're building for in the future, but they're a huge segment of the community that just aren't getting any input at all. We want to make sure that they have meaningful opportunity to influence change. And particularly relevant for this conversation, there's a commitment around making it easier for people to engage in the process and help shape proposals. So that's all about embedding and integrating digital and more analog engagement techniques and tools into the process. So we're working hard at the moment to really embed that within our business. We want community engagement to be seen as important as surveying is within our industry. So we've got a capacity building programme with around 40 staff to make sure that they feel equipped and able to deliver on it. So alongside the charter as well, we've also got a series of essays and thought pieces from some community members, some residents, and people that work to deliver community engagement. So they're really insightful, and it's good to see it from the other side, which we don't always take the time to do. So I definitely recommend checking those out.
Great. And can I just ask what the timing, the reasoning behind the timing of the release of the report? I mean, is there a reason why it hasn't been released before? I mean, is COVID-19 been the catalyst for that?
It's not been the catalyst as such. We were already developing and planning to release it, so it's quite appropriate that it's come out at this time, as now we've had more of a focus on community engagement. But it really is just that it's landed that way. This was always something that we were committed to developing and doing, and whilst the report has been launched and our commitment to do it has started, that's not the end of the process, that's the beginning of it. So now we need to really start training and equipping our staff and delivering on it. There's another commitment around accountability. So this is something that's going to be a very long conversation, and that we continue to build and deliver on.
Yeah, and that was one of the key aspects, wasn't it? That a really important way to build trust was be able to hold local authorities and developers to account. So how do you actually go about doing that in practice?
So that was one of the key reasons that people didn't trust developers, that they didn't feel there was an accountability, or that they were being kind of checked on. So in order to rebuild that, we need to make sure that we're communicating much more clearly and transparently. At the moment, there's a huge gap between the community and a business like a developer. So it's really up to us to be able to explain our proposals, our objectives, and to establish ways to have an ongoing two-way conversation. Hannah pulled out the point that that's also around partnerships. So there's already these partnerships and relationships that exist. It's up to us to be able to plug into those and really be able to listen and make the most. We also need to be able to offer genuine choices, and that's why starting early is so important, so that we're not shoehorning in people's opinions and feedback at a late stage. And when there isn't a choice, we need to be able to explain why in a really clear and coherent way. So hopefully if we can just continue to deliver against those aims and methods of reporting, we can start to build trust and prove that we're genuine in our proposals for the future.
Yeah, so early engagement, clarity and genuine choice for the communities in which we're operating in. Okay, that's great. I just want to open up a more general question to the whole panel now. A key theme that's coming out of the council and WPA is sustainability. And I think everyone can agree it's a really important topic. And at a Movers and Shakers event a few days ago, Councillor Robertson, who's the leader of Westminster City Council, said bringing in green spaces and sustainability was really key to be giving people confidence to re-enter the West End. So I just wanted to ask you guys, I mean, you're at the coalface of this, you're constantly engaging with communities. Is sustainability something that communities are responding to you and saying is an important issue to them? Or is it something that's coming from a top-down agenda?
From my perspective, when we talk to our communities, and we just did a big engagement on our emerging joint local plan, you know, it was absolutely up there. It's coming from the communities, and that link, you know, and interestingly, this was a pre-COVID consultation, but the link to saying health and well-being and climate change are really, really intrinsically linked was made by community members. You know, we didn't put those two themes sort of together in that way, but a lot of people made the link that, you know, what's good for the climate is also good for us, good for our communities and our health and well-being as well. So I think that is a huge, huge thing going forward.
I agree with Hannah. Every sort of campaign that we've run across all of our consultations, so whether it's in Bristol, Cambridge, London, sustainability is always the key theme that comes back. And we've had a lot of really constructive feedback, as I said before, where community members are sending examples from maybe Sweden or Japan or all of these different developments that they've seen which incorporate sustainable initiatives and suggesting why don't we use this, or why don't we try this, and it's really interesting to see that people are like incredibly invested in it, and it's definitely something that also gets the most clicks in terms of marketing as well. So if we put an ad out that mentions green space or sustainability or sort of eco well-being, that is always the one that drives the most traffic to the site.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting, and also something that we're seeing come through from young people as well. So we recently launched a survey called Young Mayfair and Young Belgravia, and what was coming through in these comments consistently from young people, they weren't perhaps using words like sustainability or ecology, but they were talking about air pollution, green space, trees, nature, and that's something that they want to see as well. And it's really time that we start to respond to that need.
Yeah, and I think young people is quite an interesting one, because digital engagement should be reaching those people a lot more. And I think that's something we can all agree is really important. But the UK has an ageing population. So anecdotally, elderly people are probably less up to date with technology. They probably like to engage with people more on a face-to-face basis. So how do you kind of marry those two differences of opinion? And it's actually a question that's just come through from Zoom about how do we engage people who don't have access, who aren't confident on technology. So do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, Nicola.
Thanks. I definitely think there were some parts of our communities that don't use digital as much and were slightly concerned by a programme that was more emphasised towards the digital aspects. But there's some really simple ways that you can respond to that. So speaking to people on the phone, explaining the process, not necessarily expecting people to do it all themselves. So whilst we might not be able to meet face to face, that doesn't mean that you can't pick up the phone, you can't send a letter, you can't have an outdoor exhibition or display. So I think it's also around thinking traditionally but creatively as well.
I think
yeah, I agree. Oh, sorry.
I think we should be careful not to make assumptions about who doesn't use digital technology. So a lot of older people have become much more digitally enabled as a result of COVID. Their grandchildren have got them on Zoom, they've got them on Facebook so that they can do mutual aid with their neighbours and so forth. And, I think that's a real positive. But actually there are some other groups who maybe aren't the same as the elderly groups who are really digitally, disengaged and have some real challenges. For instance, one of the things around the COVID outbreaks in the West Midlands and in places like that has been around some Asian ethnic communities, and actually they're not online, and so much of the messaging around COVID was put out on social media and it just wasn't reaching them. So, I think just being really careful about what your demographic is and talking to them. If you talk to your communities, they will tell you what tools work for them, and then you can shape your engagement to meet that need.
Yeah, I agree with both what Nicola and Hannah said. We actually, interestingly, a lot of the time find that our highest number of clicks from Facebook comes through from the over 65 age group. So they are quite engaged on social media, and as Hannah said, a lot of grandchildren have sort of trained them up. But also when we're running consultations in sort of housing regenerations, we'll use text or email campaigns as well. We always print little business cards to go out to local shops and schools. And the Give My View is a web app, so you can access it on a library computer. It's not something that you have to download. So we, as Nicola said, finding creative ways and also going out into the community when it is possible to use it with them on an iPad. And I just think making sure that you're considering everyone's different ability to engage, as Hannah said as well.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all. It has to be specific to the community that you're working in. And like you say, the more choice, the more transparency, so the better results that you're going to get. So yeah, absolutely. And we've just had that survey pop up about online engagement being as valuable as offline engagement. And even though 56% said somewhat, there was still a sizable portion, 39%, saying absolutely. So I think people understand the message that digital has got a place, and particularly alongside traditional forms of engagement, it's really valuable. Just another quick question. We've all worked with different communities across London and probably throughout the UK. There's always some aspects of the community that are just opposed to development. They just don't want to see it happen in their community. And despite, like you say, all these different forms of communication and engagement, you're always going to get some resistance to development. How would you guys go about dealing with that? Do you have to accept that, unfortunately, you can't please all the people all the time? Or do you have different ways that you can actually address that?
I think to some extent, there's always going to be people that you can't sort of convert as such, but I think education is a real key part of helping that as well, and telling people sort of, a lot of people I don't think realise the money that goes back into the community from a development, and I think by telling people and educating people around that, that really helps as well. But yeah, a lot of the time there is going to be people who just are not converted.
Definitely, I think we've all experienced that. So education seems to be the answer. Hannah and Nicola, do you agree with that?
I think that it's, the aim of, in my view, the aim of community engagement is not to try and generate some magic consensus. That's just never going to happen. It's not a realistic aim. But it is to try and really understand what are the things that matter to people, and how can you make a difference and shape your scheme around that, even if people are still ultimately maybe would rather that scheme didn't happen, but that it is meaningfully shaped by the long-term issues that are within that community. I think there's also something around explaining the strategic context. I think planning affects everybody's life very fundamentally. It shapes the places we all live and spend all of our days. Yet talk to most people, they have no idea about the structures within government and within our system which shape that. So, the decisions aren't always ours. We have housing delivery tests, we have all of this kind of stuff that we have to meet as planners and as developers. And it isn't in our gift, if the community say, well, we don't want that, sometimes we can't do anything about that. So I think that longer term education of people around the system, and then if they have issues with that, talking politically actually about, you know, maybe you should be talking to your MP about this, maybe you should be talking, you know, at a different level. Some things can't be solved at a scheme level.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think that Hannah's touched on an interesting point, that we need to understand that the communities know these neighbourhoods in ways that we don't, and there's always space for learning from these conversations, even those that might be slightly trickier. We can never meet everyone's needs, but we always need to listen first and understand and interrogate why someone feels that way. And it comes back to the points I raised earlier around offering meaningful choices, explaining why you can't when there isn't an option to do that, and being transparent. We're starting from quite a low bar for some people, and so it's going to be a slow process, but building more accountability and trust will ultimately only help us move forward together.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that education and interaction with the system is also really important. But what's interesting is Westminster held their Planning and City Committee, I think it was a couple of days ago now. And like you would expect, it's been digitalised so more people can actually access it, which has been a key thing that we've been talking about today. However, they conducted a survey about the people who have actually interacted with the system, and what rather worryingly, it's actually dropped the amount of people who said they feel welcome at planning committees. So in February to September 2019, it was 90% of respondents who said they felt welcomed. But September to March 2020, it was only 74%. So despite this stuff that we're talking about, that people should be able to access it, they need to understand the planning system better, we're now having the tools to do that, we're actually seeing a reverse of what we're talking about. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that and why you think that might be.
I think what that does show is that whilst digital engagement has gone from being a supporting tool to a leading tool, and it might continue that way for some of the process, it shouldn't ever mean or imply that we drop the other methods. We do miss out on quite a lot from those face-to-face conversations. There's body language, spontaneous conversations, and just things that you don't pick up online that we learn so much from. So I think what that stat shows is that people are still yearning for it, and so whilst digital methods are very sensible for some elements of the process, it shouldn't totally replace those physical face-to-face engagements that we so need.
Yeah, and how about yourself, Hannah? Do you have any thoughts on that, just with your experience in both the public and private sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very tricky moment at the moment. You know, we can't expect everybody who wants to be engaged and involved to have the headspace at this point in time as well to engage. Yeah. So I think, I'm not sure we should always judge the success of some of these digital tools by the COVID moment, but we should be learning from the really accelerated pace of experimentation that we're going through, and saying, well, for the next year, 2 years, you know, ongoing, how can we use those tools and start to measure them over time? Because it is a very extraordinary moment here. People are very concerned, very, you know, often, you know, very worried about their lives and their relatives and so forth. And it's not always the right time to start to try and get people to, you know, suddenly log on to a council meeting.
Yeah.
And I think developers and councils are, you know, need to be very cautious about that for that reason. You know, you don't want to be perceived, even if that's not your intention, as rushing things through at a moment where communities are distracted. So just thinking carefully about, does this really need to come forward now? You know, we've had some projects where communities have said, yes, please keep going, we've got loads of momentum, we really want to see this thing go through. You know, but there are others where it's definitely been right to slow down, just take a pause, let that community deal with the situation, and then we'll come back when things feel a bit safer and a bit more comfortable.
And just on that point, Hannah, we found it really helpful using digital methods that people can access in their own time at a time that suits them. So uploading recorded videos to Facebook or YouTube, and actually the playback stats on that have been incredible. So it is working. When you offer people these choices and these options, they will take it and they will engage with it when they have the capacity to. We just need to be open to that.
Yeah, and actually we've just received an audience question from Rossa Han, who said, do you think COVID-19 and social distancing will change the way communities will want to be consulted? So that kind of leads on to that. Do you guys have any predictions on that? Do you think it's going to get back to normal in a few months' time and people will want to start meeting up face to face again? Or are you prepared for kind of a long-term gradual reintroduction to this?
I think it will be long term. There are people who won't feel, for health reasons, very able to engage in a face-to-face way for some time. You know, people who have been shielding, people who are vulnerable. But I think let's not forget that this isn't new. There have always been people who haven't been able to come to a face-to-face consultation. And we need to be aware that a lot of the practices that have been sort of normal in the past few years haven't actually been that effective either. So this is a really good moment just to take stock of some of that and say, how do we offer more choice generally? Because choice means accessibility, as Emily and Nicola have both kind of said. If you have more choices about how to engage, that is more open, more accessible to more people with different needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. How about you, Emily and Nicola? Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it'll be a blend, as Hannah said. Sorry, I think people will, now that they're more aware that digital engagement is sort of a choice, that maybe more people will continue to engage. But I think the people who were engaging in person before COVID would still probably like to have the opportunity to go back to in-person consultations. And I think there should be the opportunity there for both aspects of both in-person and digital. And it should sort of be a blend, and people can access both. But as Hannah said, I think it will be long term and people won't be rushing back to in-person consultations.
Just out of interest, does Built ID actually have any projects where you'd like to get back to traditional face-to-face communication? Or are you, like you say, you're just taking it as it comes and at the moment it's going to have to just be digital?
Well, we always run the digital side of consultations. So we will go sort of, if the developer has a public consultation, we will go along to it, but we wouldn't necessarily organise a public consultation. So we would always go along with the iPads to the in-person consultations, but never actually organised one. We have done a few estate regenerations where we've gone out and handed out leaflets and the business cards and everything. So that's the sort of in-person stuff that we do, but not actually the events as such.
Great. So just conscious of time and we're slowly running out of it. Final question really, do you have any one big takeaway or prediction for how you think community engagement is going to evolve going forward? It's kind of an extension of what we were just talking about, but yeah, your one big kind of prediction for the future.
Okay, because I didn't do the other one. I definitely think, as the others have touched on, it's going to be a blend of the two, but we're going to need to think much more creatively about what that looks like. People know they have the option now of doing a survey rather than coming along to a community hall. So how are we going to respond to that need? And I think that there's ways such as in-person exhibitions in public spaces that aren't necessarily at dedicated times for people to drop into. Rather than having the team there, you might have an audio tour or something people can scan to see a VR or something. I think that a blend of the two strands will definitely be something that we see come forward, because that's ultimately how we're going to strengthen this engagement and build more choices and options that Hannah rightly said is how you get better representation.
I think,
how about you?
Oh, sorry.
Go on, Emily.
I think COVID has accelerated a lot of trends that were already sort of in the pipeline before the pandemic happened. So such as the building of smart cities and sort of appointments and everything going online. So I think digital engagement will sort of pick up and a lot of things are going to have been accelerated. So people are going to be getting more used to doing a lot more things online, even though we already did pretty much everything online anyway. So I think, yeah, that is going to be, it's going to be easier for people to engage in processes that they didn't necessarily know they had the ability to engage in pre-COVID. But yeah, I also agree with Nicola that the blend is going to be important and to still, as I said before, have the opportunity to do both.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that Emily and Nicola have said. I think that communities will be more demanding actually about how we do things, and that's going to put pressure on resources, both in the private and in the public sector. You know, to adequately fund that kind of work, it does take people and time and money. But I think the other thing that I think is going to be an interesting to come out of this period is this renewed focus on the neighbourhood level. And I think that's got implications not only in terms of how schemes stack up and the type of mix of uses that we provide, but also that level of engagement. You know, what different groups come out of this that operate at that neighbourhood level and really are knitting people together in a way that hasn't been seen in quite to that degree. You know, so the mutual aid groups, the groups that have been set up now, I don't think they're going to vanish once COVID is, you know, sort of felt to be under control. I think they're just going to morph into different ways of supporting neighbours. So the more we can, as property professionals, plug into those networks and really kind of embed ourselves with them as trusted partners, the better.
Great. So I think that's just about it, unless anyone else has any final comments they'd like to make. No, so huge thanks for the panel for joining us today. It's been a really great discussion. It's great to see how passionate we all are about engagement and bringing the communities on board in the developments that we're working on. Thank you to London Property Alliance for organising today's seminar, and to G&T for, again, their ongoing support. And of course, thank you to all of our listeners today. We hope you've had a really interesting discussion and you've got a few things to take away. So keep safe and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Bye.
all.